Picture a plant that grows wild across every continent on Earth. People have been using it for 12,000 years. Ancient Chinese emperors prescribed it as medicine. Hindu priests called it sacred. George Washington grew it on his farm. For most of human history, it was completely legal everywhere in the world. Then, in 1937, the United States banned it almost overnight. And within a few decades, most of the world followed. The official reason? It was dangerous. A menace to society. A gateway drug that would corrupt the youth and destroy communities. But here's what the official story leaves out. The men who pushed hardest for that ban had almost nothing to do with public health. They had everything to do with money, specifically theirs and how a legal plant was threatening to take it away. This is the real reason weed was made illegal. To understand what happened, you need to meet three men. William Randolph Hearst, the most powerful newspaper publisher in America. Andrew Mellon, Treasury Secretary and one of the wealthiest bankers in the country. And Harry Anslinger, the man Mellon personally appointed to lead the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics. These three men, each with something to protect and something to gain, would orchestrate one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in American history. But to understand why they did it, you first have to understand the plant they were trying to kill. Not marijuana, which was a word most Americans had never heard before 1930. Hemp. Hemp and marijuana come from the same plant, Cannabis sativa. The difference is in how it's used. Hemp, the industrial variety, has almost no psychoactive properties. You can't get high from it. What you can do is make rope, paper, fabric, fuel, and building materials from it. And in the early 20th century, farmers across America were growing enormous quantities of it. Here's where William Randolph Hearst enters the picture. Hearst owned millions of acres of timber forest. His entire newspaper empire, which stretched across nearly every major American city, was built on paper made from wood pulp. His forests were his infrastructure. They were the foundation of his fortune. In the 1930s, a new machine called the decorticator was being developed. It could process hemp fiber quickly and cheaply enough to make hemp paper cost-competitive with wood pulp paper. A Popular Mechanics article from 1938 would eventually call hemp the new billion-dollar crop. If hemp paper took off commercially, Hearst's timber holdings would take a devastating hit. Andrew Mellon's concern was different but equally financial. He was the primary investor in DuPont, the chemical company that had just patented two revolutionary new synthetic materials, nylon and a new wood pulp process for making paper. Both of these products competed directly with hemp. DuPont needed hemp to be marginalized, or better yet, eliminated from the market entirely, to protect its investment. So Mellon appointed his own niece's husband, Harry Anslinger, to run the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And Anslinger, who had spent years trying and largely failing to build a federal case against cannabis, suddenly found himself with powerful backers, a mandate, and a very specific mission. The campaign they launched was breathtaking in its cynicism. Anslinger started feeding Hearst's newspapers a steady stream of sensational stories about cannabis, and Hearst's papers ran them, prominently, repeatedly, with headlines that seem almost comically extreme today. Stories about men driven to murder by a single cigarette. Stories about children turned into raving lunatics overnight. Stories about jazz musicians seducing young white women with the help of this foreign drug. That word, foreign, was doing a lot of work in these stories. Anslinger was explicit in his memos and testimony about which populations he associated with cannabis use. He called it the marijuana menace, deliberately using the Spanish-derived term marijuana instead of hemp or cannabis because it sounded foreign, because it connected the plant to Mexican immigrants and black jazz musicians, because fear of the plant and fear of those communities could be made to reinforce each other. The racism was not incidental. It was the strategy. Anslinger wrote in a memo, and this is a real quote, "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men." He told Congress that most of the cannabis users in America were Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers, and that their use was causing white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes. This was not a fringe position he kept quiet. He said this in official government testimony. By 1937, Hearst's papers had spent years saturating the American public with marijuana hysteria. The word hemp had been strategically replaced with marijuana in almost all public discussion, so that most Americans genuinely did not realize that the dangerous foreign drug they were reading about was the same plant American farmers had been growing for generations. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 moved through Congress in an extraordinary rush. The hearings lasted 2 days. The American Medical Association sent a representative who testified that there was no medical evidence to justify prohibition, and that the bill had been prepared in secret without consulting physicians. Congress essentially ignored him. The bill passed, hemp was gone, marijuana was a federal crime. And here's the part that gets even darker. The prohibition did not stop cannabis use. What it did was hand control of the market to criminal organizations. It created a black market worth billions of dollars. It gave law enforcement a powerful new tool to target and arrest people from specific communities. An outcome that, looking at Anslinger's documented views, seems less like an unintended consequence and more like a built-in feature. For the next several decades, enforcement of marijuana laws fell almost entirely on black and brown Americans, even though studies consistently showed that white Americans used cannabis at similar rates. The prohibition that was sold to the public as a public health measure functioned in practice as a mechanism of social control. In 1971, President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs. His domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, would later give an interview where he said something remarkable. He said that the Nixon administration had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people, and that by associating the left with marijuana and black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, they could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Then he said, "Oh, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. That is not a fringe theory. That is a former White House official on the record, describing the war on drugs as a deliberate political weapon." By this point, the financial interests that had started the whole thing were long established. Hemp had been off the market long enough that the industries it might have threatened were now deeply entrenched. DuPont's synthetics dominated, timber companies owned the paper market, and a new set of interests had accumulated around prohibition itself. Private prison industries, pharmaceutical companies that benefited from cannabis remaining unscheduled, law enforcement agencies whose budgets depended on drug arrests. The machinery was self-perpetuating now. It didn't need Hearst or Mellon or Anslinger anymore. It ran on its own momentum. And the science, the actual evidence about what cannabis does and doesn't do to people, it kept piling up in contradiction to everything Anslinger had claimed. Study after study found that cannabis was not the violent madness-inducing substance he had described. The Nixon administration commissioned its own major study in 1972, the Schaefer Commission, specifically expecting it to validate the prohibition. Instead, it recommended decriminalization. Nixon buried the report, because by then the prohibition wasn't really about the science. It had never been about the science. It was about power and money and which communities the law was designed to protect and which ones it was designed to control. Today, the landscape is shifting. More than half of American states have legalized cannabis in some form. Countries around the world are revisiting policies that were often adopted simply because the United States pressured them to. The medical evidence for cannabis as a legitimate treatment for chronic pain, anxiety, epilepsy, and other conditions is now too large to ignore. But 12,000 years of human history with this plant were interrupted by a decade of strategic propaganda from men who had timber investments and chemical patents to protect. Millions of people were incarcerated for activities their grandparents had done legally. Entire communities were targeted and disrupted under laws that were crafted, at least in part, to target them specifically. The real reason weed was made illegal wasn't because it was dangerous. It was because it was profitable and it was threatening to make someone else's investments less so. And once the machinery of prohibition was in place, a whole new set of people had reasons to keep it running. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's the paper trail.